Hey everybody, today I'm going to talk about the 1979 film The Amityville Horror, which is about a family who is terrorized by a house that is possessed by evil spirits. But as we will see, underneath all this lurks something far more terrifying that almost all men face. Okay, in case you're not familiar with the plot, and I'm not spoiling anything here, The Amityville Horror is about a family with young kids who buys a house in Long Island, New York. And this house was the scene of the grisly mass murder of an entire family a year before. They encounter some very strange and scary things there, and then they flee in terror 28 days after moving in. One of the many fascinating things about the Amityville Horror is the multiple layers of narrative and truth that are interwoven in this film. This house in Amityville, Long Island was in actual fact the scene of some brutal murders in 1974 in which a troubled young man named Ronald DeFeo methodically shot his entire family of 6 dead in their beds with a lever-action rifle. George and Kathy Lutz, the couple portrayed in the movie, did in fact buy the same house about a year after the murders, and they did in fact abandon the house 28 days later. Most of the rest of the Lutz's story, along with the novel based on that story, and this film, which was based on that novel, are simply fiction. If you're interested in a skeptical take on all this, then check out the book American Hauntings by Robert Bartholomew and Joe Nickell. If you're more the supernatural, paranormal type, then you might want to skip that book. Okay, as fascinating as the backstory to the Amityville Horror is, the most interesting aspect of the film to me is the purely human element of this story. We are introduced to the film version of George and Kathy Lutz at the beginning, and they're an attractive newlywed couple, played by James Brolin and Margot Kidder. And this couple is considering buying their first house together. The first thing you'll notice is that George and Kathy are not super young. They look like they're maybe in their late 30s, or at least George does. So this is probably a second marriage for both of them. And Kathy has 3 kids of her own, so George is the new stepdad. So right away we see that this is not a young June and Ward Cleaver here. This is a family that is duct taped together from the pieces of failed relationships. And all the necessary ingredients for hell on earth are likely already present before they even move into this house. The key character in Amityville Horror is George. James Brolin is perfect in the role of George. He's the kind of guy who appears calm and collected at first, but there's something not right about him. He has this absent quality, like his brain is processing something in the background, kind of like a laptop whose screen is locked up, but the CPU fan sounds like a vacuum cleaner. We start to realize that George is like a human time bomb, and he looks progressively crazier with each scene in this film. On the surface, George's troubles are pretty clear. He seems to have gone out of his way to create problems for himself. Early in the film, when the newlyweds meet with their realtor to look at this house they want to buy, George is tripping over himself to tell the realtor that they don't want to start a family. They already have a family, meaning him and his new wife's kids. And he covers up any signs of doubt that this arrangement is a good idea. In fact, he's already complaining that his new wife's kids don't call him dad. So instead of thinking that his new wife is lucky to have found a man so willing to sacrifice his own freedom, time, money, and sanity for her and another man's kids, George thinks he's lucky to have her. Okay, so the romantic transaction between George and Kathy is pretty straightforward here. She gets a replacement dad for her 3 kids and a big house to raise them in, and he gets regular sex with a pretty good-looking lady, at least early in the relationship, presumably, and on top of it, he gets to play the role of patriarch of this bolted-together family. It's pretty easy to understand why this deal appeals to her. We don't know her background exactly, but we can guess that she had a bunch of kids with some loser, and now she's found a new guy with a stable job who doesn't beat her up or cheat on her too much, and that's a big step up for her. So it seems to be a great deal for her. But now let's look at George's side of the equation, and this is where it gets interesting. Almost every problem George has in this movie would disappear if he had not married this woman. In the first place, he could be living in a place that he could afford, he could be at home drinking a beer, having control of his time, and He could concentrate on his work if he wanted. He might feel lonely at first, and he'd have to work harder to get sex, but everything in life is a trade-off. That's a small price to pay to have control of your life. So why the hell would George sign up for this kind of arrangement? Well, George, by all appearances, is suffering from a number of false beliefs common among men, and these false beliefs have guided his life choices. And the primary false belief is probably the fear of loneliness, and more specifically, that dying alone is really, really bad. Now, this notion of dying alone is not something that men openly discuss very much, at least not to each other. And it's the sort of thing that is usually only verbalized in the form of a final curse coming from a spurned romantic partner. However, for the vast majority of men, it is the fear of dying alone that is a primary underlying cause of irrational choices with respect to their relationships with women, even more than the need for sex. So, what does it mean to die alone? Let's unpack this. The issue here is that men tend to think of dying alone as the worst of only two possible scenarios. And the two scenarios they imagine are, one, I die surrounded by friends and family, meaning surrounded by people who love and respect me. And two, I die alone, which means I died anonymously in some godforsaken place and nobody even noticed I was gone until the neighbors started complaining about the smell of my decomposing corpse. So there you have it, men. Those are your two choices in life. But here's the thing. The reality for the majority of men is that what actually happens is neither one of these. Most men are so terrified of this second scenario of dying anonymously and unloved that they end up sacrificing their own freedom, agency, and self-respect to avoid it. And as a consequence, they spend their final days or even final decades with a woman who on some level holds them in contempt. And the bitter irony is that the worst outcomes accrue to the men who fear dying alone the most. Whether we like it or not, when we know that our romantic partner is unlikely to leave us due to some underlying insecurity, we begin to take them for granted in the best case, and we usually become contemptuous of them over time. And it is this outcome that is by far the most likely end result for married men that I observe. The irrational fear of dying alone causes men to overestimate the value of easy, regular companionship and sex with the same woman, and underestimate the value of having freedom, self-respect, and agency in their lives. Returning to the Amityville Horror, a recurring subtext in this film is that we are our own worst nightmares. We imprison ourselves with our false beliefs. This is very strongly implied with both the main male roles in the film. The characters of both George and of Father Delaney, the priest who comes to bless the house. Consider that given all the terrifying things that happened to the Lutzes in the Amityville Horror, what was the first event that caused George to truly lose his composure? Was it the front door being blown off its hinges in the middle of the night from the inside by a mysterious force? No. Was it uncovering the passage to hell in the basement? No. Was it falling through the floor into a giant vat of blood? No. The first time George loses his cool was when his partner at work gives him a straightforward dose of reality by noticing George's suffering and saying, "Yeah, it's no wonder you aren't doing well. You married a dame with 3 kids and you're in debt up to your ass." That's when George loses it. And in case you're not convinced of the centrality of this theme of creating your own hell, recall the scene where George breaks through the basement wall to reveal the source of everything evil in this house. What does George see when he pokes his head inside? He sees nothing but himself. Okay, that's it for the Amityville Horror. Definitely check it out if you haven't seen it or if it's been a while. It really is an interesting, iconic horror film that you can appreciate on multiple levels. And it may even cause you to think about a horror that you have unwittingly constructed for yourself. Thank you for watching. I'm Rod Richards. See you next time.